I have with me today Professor M. Taylor Fravel. He is the Arthur and Sloan, Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of the MIT Security Studies Program. Welcome to the Print, Professor, and thank you for talking to the Print.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Professor, so just to start off, this is going to be the year when we are going to complete nearly 2 years of having a standoff with China, the border standoff that has also seen 20 Indian soldiers getting killed. There is phase one disengagement that has happened, as you are well aware, but the process of disengagement and de-escalation has slowed down since then. There is a worry in India whether and how long will that continue. What is your assessment on that? And do you think the demand that India constantly makes of that of returning to status quo, will that ever be achieved?
So great questions. I think we may be entering a new normal on the China-India border where there won't be either a permanent disengagement and de-escalation or a return to the status quo ante as of, say, April of 2020, although exactly what the status quo was in April of 2020 is still a little bit unclear. But I think what we have seen is China has sought to de-escalate those areas that at the tactical level were most likely to have the potential to escalate into direct armed conflict, particularly in the areas around the northern and southern banks of Pangong Lake. Also earlier in the Galwan Valley, which led to the very deadly clash in June of 2020. There still appear to be some disagreements over the Gogra-Hot Springs area, although I think those have much less escalatory potential, which might explain why they haven't been resolved. And then you have the entire sort of set of issues in Depsang, China kind of blocking India from reaching its traditional patrolling points. That appears to be a situation that precedes April 2020, but nevertheless, I think has been wrapped up into kind of perceptions of China's new posture on the border, since China continues, as far as I can tell, to block India from accessing its patrolling points. At the military level, too, you have, China has made substantial investments, not directly on the line of actual control, but in areas not too far from the line of actual control, 10, 20 or more kilometers, whereby it will, I think, have a permanent military presence, or certainly permanent military infrastructure that is more forward deployed than it was in the past. And so if the status quo of April 2020 is no forward deployed Chinese troops in these areas, I think that to me is no longer a possibility. I think at least one lesson China drew, whether correctly or incorrectly, is that it would need to have faster reaction times in these areas where the India and China contest the actual line, the location of the line of actual control, and therefore has sort of built up substantially in these areas. This doesn't mean that China will deploy tens of thousands of troops in these areas, and it's hard to get a precise figure of what China has deployed in these locations, but I think it does mean that China has kind of the infrastructure to host troops if they do deploy to this area, and if greater tensions do occur on the line of actual control, it will have troops in position that can respond quickly. And so I think that's a very notable development that won't probably change in the future. I mean, that to me looks as if it's sort of permanent sort of construction of infrastructure in that way, a change. It's not, again, to be clear, this is not in the areas where the two sides dispute the line of actual control, though it is in territory that India claims as part of Oxide Chin.
Mm-hmm. So we saw last year China coming up with a new land border law, while India chose to sort of downplay it. We get to hear from certain experts and others that India should be concerned, and this can impact the disengagement process. Is that the reason you think that the disengagement process got a little, it slowed down? And also, as what you were saying, that, this amassing of troops will continue to happen. The infrastructure is already there. India is also developing its infrastructure there. So Do you think that both sides would probably need to revisit the border issue in a completely new manner?
It's great. So two terrific questions. First, let me talk about the land border law. One feature of sort of lawmaking in China is it often is a way of codifying existing practices and formalizing them and institutionalizing them. And so I didn't see in the land border law much that was a sort of stark departure from kind of past Chinese practice or anything that would indicate a significant change in China's sort of posture in the future. But what it does do is provide a framework for how China will seek to manage its borders, including and will certainly have an impact in those areas such as the China-India border where the border is disputed. I don't think this makes China reluctant necessarily to pursue smaller tactical compromises, because China also does recognize, right, that the border with India is in dispute, and so in some sense is not completely covered by all of the elements that are in the law. But to me, the law was not a sign of a radical new approach from China, but rather a codification of existing approaches. And this is consistent with different laws in different areas that have been passed in the last 5 to 10 years, including a revision to the national defense law not too long ago. Now, that being said, other laws like the cybersecurity law, for example, are trying to cover brand new areas that I think do tell us a little bit more about the future. But this is a case of kind of codifying past practice. It does seem to me, though, onto your second question, that the agreements put in place primarily in 1993 and 1996, and the amendments to them subsequently may just not be robust enough to account for the new situation on the border. I think when those agreements were put in place, it was hard for both sides to access what they viewed to be the line of actual control. I mean, simply to physically arrive on that location, because they would often have to walk there or ride on horseback, but there certainly was not the level of infrastructure that there is today. And so because of this infrastructure, because of modernization on both sides, right, you have an ability to rapidly deploy forces towards the line of actual control. And you have an ability, I think, on both sides now to patrol most areas if they want to on a daily basis. And so this suggests that troop levels are going to be much higher than they were before. The potential for contact among forces is going to be much more frequent, which in some ways means without an additional agreement that the potential, right, for disagreements resulting from contact is also going to increase. Now, I think it is notable that in those areas where de-escalation or disengagement occurred in the agreements that were reached sort of starting in February of 2021, these sort of buffer zones or neutral zones were created where each side agreed not to patrol up to what it views as the line of actual control, right? And so that sort of was, I think, a mutual concession by both parties, since each would prefer to patrol to their limit of what they believe their claim to be. And so one could envision a new agreement, for example, and I'm probably wildly optimistic, whereby maps would actually be exchanged, just covering the areas where troops can come into contact. So I think it should set aside the Kashmir dispute that is not currently, or that does not currently cover territory where India and China can come into contact because of Pakistan's control of those areas, and focus on thinking much more about the frequency and location of patrolling and whether or not it would be advantageous from a border stability management perspective to create more neutral zones where forces from neither side would commit to entering. One could even very fancifully, and I realize I'm wildly optimistic, but why not, joint patrols of some of these areas. China and Vietnam, for example, have joint patrols in the Tonkin Gulf to sort of, now there's a settled border there, so it's a little bit different, but nevertheless, my point here is that I think the two sides need to reimagine what is possible on the border, and they need to do so with an eye towards preventing a much more rapid and intense escalation, even than what we saw in Galwan in June of 2020, because of the way in which both sides have deployed or are in the process of sort of creating infrastructure for much greater sort of troop levels than has been the case in the past. And so in some ways, these developments that have sort of culminated in what happened in June of 2020 simply have outgrown the previous agreements. And I don't think they necessarily provide the best framework for moving forward, particularly from the perspective of simply managing stability on the border. I don't envision, or whether or not the two sides could come to a political agreement over the actual contested sovereignty right is a completely separate matter. So I think, as a practical step, the most important action both sides can take is thinking about how to sort of bring long-term stability back to the border that was kind of disrupted by what happened or what culminated in June of 2020, and to take into account new factors, new considerations, which would be the military power that both sides can now bring to bear in these areas, which was simply not the case 20 or 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So you're basically saying that all the 6 border agreements, I mean, the protocols that were in place, they might all be outdated now, and probably we would need one comprehensive border understanding, right?
Yeah, they basically need to be, updated and refreshed. I mean, the spirit of them was good, but the specifics are probably no longer as relevant in light of the fact that, because they are basically crafted at a time when the troops really didn't come into contact. And now troops are going to come into contact pretty frequently. And they have in the last decade already come into contact much more frequently. And so I think you need a new agreement to, there were efforts to do this. I don't want to dismiss the efforts by both sides either, but the problem now just seems to be much larger than those prior agreements and their amendments can contain.
Yes, because this is something both foreign ministers, I mean, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and Foreign Minister Wang have discussed in 2020 and 2021. But coming to the fact that, we are speaking at a time when there is a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and it's probably going to enter its 3rd month, for all you know, and there's just, both sides are having this war raging on. But while a lot has been said and discussed about India's position in this, India is also concerned with the fact that maybe this will be one chapter in which Russia and China will come very close together. Do you think that's something India needs to watch out for?
Well, clearly, I think at the political level, right, in the run-up to the war, China and Russia did come closer together, culminating in the February 4th agreement, or joint statement, not an agreement, joint statement, that was issued when Putin visited China for the Winter Olympics. And it's a very long list of sort of shared grievances, principally with the United States or a US-led order, and sort of general objectives or a general outline of a different or an alternative international order that Russia and China would prefer, and which sort of maximizes their sort of autonomy and freedom of maneuver and all the rest of it. This is really a culmination of 2 decades of ever increasing Russia-China relations, right? This did not happen overnight, although I do think it accelerated in the last few years, principally as US-China relations, declined precipitously. I think under those circumstances, right, the common ground or the mutual interest between China and Russia grew even further, although there are already substantial common or mutual interests. I think, however, though, China was probably not informed specifically of what Putin might do. Putin may not have known what he was going to do on the 4th of February. And of course, at that time, many analysts were divided over whether or not Russia would in fact attack, which now, of course, seems obvious since Russia did attack. But at the time, if you recall, among various experts, there was a pretty lively debate: was this, brinksmanship on the part of Putin for the sake of negotiation, or was it simply preparing, to invade, which of course is what subsequently happened. I think China, however, has sort of found itself sort of cornered or boxed in a place where it might prefer not to be. So on the one hand, it continues to provide a full-throated support of the Russian kind of explanation for the rationale of the war, which is focusing on NATO expansion. And China, of course, has also used the conflict to sort of as an opportunity to enhance and propagate its own narrative about the United States being sort of a source of global instability. And so if you were to read sort of statements by the foreign ministry spokesperson in the last week or so, they almost sound as if the United States, not Russia, was the country that had invaded Ukraine and caused all of the sort of death and destruction there, right? But so China's taken a very, not just sort of a stance that is pro-Russian with respect to the political rationale for the war, but also one that is very much trying to make America culpable for what has happened. At the same time, China is trying, although I think not necessarily successfully, to adopt a somewhat neutral position with its humanitarian, a 6-point humanitarian plan, although it doesn't seem to have produced much in actual aid, and this idea that the UN Charter must be respected, and both Ukrainian and Russian security concerns must be respected. And so China has also not taken any steps to help Russia break the sanctions or to circumvent the sanctions. And as far as I know, China has not provided any military equipment to aid Russia in its war effort, right? And so politically and diplomatically, it leans very heavily towards Russia. In other areas, I think China's trying not necessarily to become sort of too closely attached to Russia with respect to the war, which after all is terribly unpopular in Europe. And Europe, of course, was the one area that China was seeking to engage through a charm offensive in order to weaken the West and basically to divide Europe from the United States. And so China has actually subverted its own kind of diplomatic strategy for coping with the United States, right, which really had 2 points. One was to get closer to Russia, and the other was to get closer to Europe. And China has completely alienated Europe. Now, in other parts of the developing world, China's approach may face a more welcome reception in certain circles. So I don't want to at all leave the impression, right, that the entire world, except for China, is united against Russia. Other countries, right, including India, have taken more moderate sort of approaches in sort of their public statements with respect to condemning or not condemning the war. But certainly China is, I think, the country that's been most sort of forceful in siding with Russia. And so China faces a balancing act. On the one hand, its economic future does not lie with Russia, right? It lies with sort of the integrated global economic order, which means it actually requires a pretty workable relationship with the United States and with Europe and with other critical economies. And so we'll have to see what happens. But I don't see China necessarily viewing it as in its longer term interest to become even closer to Russia, especially as Russia becomes more isolated from the United States and from European countries in particular, because that I think will subvert other Chinese international objectives.
Mm-hmm. Also, Professor Fravel, if you can tell us, how do you assess Chinese Foreign Minister Wang's visit to India last month, and also whatever is happening in South Asia right now, be it the meltdown in Sri Lanka and also in Pakistan? Do you see an overarching role that China is playing in all of these? I just want to understand, how do you view all this?
So I think Wang Yi's visit was notable for several reasons. First, it was a reminder that China would like to pursue a reset with India, right, to sort of put the genie back into the bottle and return to a diplomatic status quo ante, if you will, of the way in which ties had developed before the events of 2020. I don't think India has the same desire, so it probably will not occur for a period of time, but nevertheless, I think it signifies a Chinese intent, right, to sort of bolster other important diplomatic relationships that it has, especially as ties with Europe and the United States continue to deteriorate, right? So India becomes more important for China in that regard. And I think China, at least in Wang Yi's public statements and in other public statements, seems to want to sort of portray the border as an issue that can be separated from the rest of the bilateral relationship, and thus the rest of the bilateral. So even if progress can't be made on the border, the rest of the bilateral relationship will or should continue to flourish. Now, economically, it actually has flourished in the last 2 years. I think the countries are now trading more than ever before, China and India. I have to check the specific numbers, but I saw something the other day that talked about significant sort of increased trade between China and India. But politically and in terms of popular opinion, public opinion, right, I'm sure that that's not the case. But nevertheless, I think that was a significant part of Wang Yi's visit. I think China also wants to show that its unwillingness to condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine has or allows it to make common cause with other countries like India, who've also not made a similar condemnation, although I think India's approach is different from China's approach, but there are at least some superficial similarities. And I think, China's diplomacy has remained very active despite COVID. And so, Wang Yi is perhaps, one of the busiest foreign ministers in the world, right? He's always traveling, he's always somewhere. And I think that's a sign, not necessarily in Europe, but or in America, but he's pretty active in throughout the developing world. And I think that signifies China's importance to bolstering ties in those regions, especially as it needs to sort of confront worsened ties with, excuse me, with the West and with the United States and Europe. Now, with regards to other issues in South Asia, I don't think, or I don't know, I should say, I don't track these perhaps as closely as I should. I don't know how closely China has been involved with them or how closely China follows them. I mean, clearly China follows them to some extent, but I don't think China is necessarily seeking to play an active role in either country. At the end of the day, right, in its diplomacy, right, China values stability in relations with partner countries. And so when they go through political transitions, China wants to, at a minimum, make sure that it can work with the new government, or if the country is going through internal upheaval for other reasons, that it will sort of ultimately have stable ties at the end. I think this was most evident in China's engagement with the Taliban last summer, right? Because it knew that the Taliban would become the effective or de facto government of Afghanistan, and it was going to figure out how to get along with it, even before the completion of the U.S. withdrawal and the collapse of the national government of Afghanistan. And so this is a very pragmatic stream in Chinese diplomacy. So I think their first priority would be to try to understand these political developments and make sure they would have working relationships with the new political leaders, certainly in Pakistan, and then probably just watching very closely what happens with Sri Lanka for similar reasons.
Mm-hmm. Now, coming to China per se, Professor Fravel, I do understand there's a lot of churning going on within the Chinese Communist Party. I believe President Xi Jinping has set up some central coordination organizations to look after the country's foreign policy and security policies. How do you see this moves, in the longer run?
Well, China's going through a very delicate moment right now in its politics. I'm going to take your question in a slightly different direction and then come back. With the outbreak of Omicron in China and lockdowns in many cities, which include, I don't know, roughly 300 to 400 million people. I don't have the precise figures at the tip of my fingers, but this is right. Significant urban areas have been effectively closed, which has ripple effects on the economy, at least in the short term. But this matters because this is the year of the 20th Party Congress, which will be held sometime in the fall. Most likely, my guess is the end of October, maybe early November. The date is never set until a few weeks before. It's not sort of scheduled far in advance. But it's the year in which most observers, almost all observers, believe Xi will start a third term as general secretary and as chairman of the military commission, and then certainly continue as president, which is no longer a term limited position when the National People's Congress meets the following spring. But it's also a party Congress where he may start to put in place arrangements for his succession, or at least to be able to maintain power for a much longer period of time going into the 21st and 22nd Party Congresses. This means focusing in particular on appointments to the Central Committee, which is sort of the pool of political elites from which the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee are usually drawn from in subsequent party congresses. So this is a very delicate sort of moment. It's perhaps the most important party congress in China since 1978, with the third plenum that sort of formally endorsed Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policies. So you have actually a pretty significant domestic political event, which is challenging the zero COVID policy, which China and Xi had trumpeted, right, as being a uniquely successful approach attributed to the strength of the Communist Party of China now coming under question. And you have, I think, concerns about the way in which China might be isolated or further isolated, especially from key economies because of the war in Russia. And because in essence, China, became too close with Russia, which again, I think is a policy for which she and only she is responsible. And so it's a very delicate moment, which means that there's efforts to coordinate both China's foreign security policies and what they call their state or national security policies. There are two different commissions which have been established to govern these. There's the Central Foreign Affairs Commission, which used to be the Central Foreign Affairs Office of the Central Committee, but it was upgraded to a commission a few years ago. Its director is Yang Jiechi, and it sort of serves as the lead coordinating body for foreign policy issues, which also includes security issues. It has a fairly long history. I won't review that for you, but it was sort of upgraded. But the newer body, which was only established a few years ago, is translated either as the National Security Commission or the State Security Commission. I sort of prefer State Security Commission because it prevents facile and superficial comparisons with the U.S. National Security Council. But what distinguishes this body is that it has a much more domestic orientation, right? It's principally focused on internal regime security for the party versus sort of the broad array of national security issues, including foreign policy and defense policy and the rest of it, although it has some links to that. And so it's an exceptionally important body, though, because it sort of highlights how important kind of maintaining stability is in the country and sort of being able to preempt very quickly any challenges that might emerge that could question the authority of the Communist Party. And so in both of these areas, there's very close efforts to coordinate Chinese policies through these bodies. And of course, they have a very close relationship with Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm. But what you said was very key. Do you think that in the next upcoming meeting of the party, will they be really looking at succession? I mean, for President Xi?
I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows. But what I would be watching for is whether or not on the Politburo in particular, there are people young enough to be on the standing committee at either the 21st Party Congress or the 22nd Party Congress. In other words, at some point, I think she will either have to be elevated to a new position, such as party chairman, which has remained vacant since the 1970s. Only two people held it, and really only one person held it, which was Mao. That's one option that she has. Another option that she has is, but even if he became party chairman, he may still need a general secretary for the party. The other alternative is perhaps a more recent traditional approach, which would be to say a new general secretary would be selected at either the 21st or 22nd Party Congresses, but Xi Jinping would, of course, that person would be part of Xi's faction or sort of political base, and thus Xi would sort of, move to the background a little bit, but still very much be sort of the most influential person in Chinese politics. So there are different ways in which this could unravel, but I think at some point, right, Xi will need to rely on younger Chinese political leaders to help him, especially as he ages. And so whether it's at this Congress, maybe the next one, we would want to track very closely, who is put on the Politburo, not the standing committee, but the Politburo, maybe the standing committee. I mean, it'd be very interesting, right, if someone was put on the standing committee at this Congress who was young enough to become general secretary at the next Congress, right? That would be just a very interesting possibility. And if there were two or three people like that, it would be even more interesting. I'm not sure Xi is quite ready to go in that direction, especially since this has been a quite tumultuous year for China, but maybe he is. And if not, then we would want to look at individuals of similar ages who would be on the larger Politburo itself, who then could move to the standing committee and eventually become, or at least be in position to become a general secretary of the party at a subsequent party congress. And so this is why I think it's the most critical party congress since the reform and opening period started in China.
Mhm. Um, Another thing that we are observing right now, Professor Fravel, is what you also said, is how the COVID situation is evolving in some of the urban centers, horrific images coming out of Shanghai. Now, at a situation like this, and traveling to China has literally been completely stopped. I mean, it's a closed country for now, as Indian students are also not being allowed. So, do you think that also kind of dents China's image as this economic powerhouse, and also what President Xi Jinping sort of envisions? How do you see that will, sort of impact or play out as far as Chinese politics is concerned?
Um, so I think in terms of China's closure, right, to much of the world. I mean, it's very difficult to go back to China. Even if you're a Chinese citizen, you could easily have quarantines that last for a month. There was a fascinating story in the New York Times a few weeks ago about a Chinese individual living in America who returned to China to see his parents for the Spring Festival, the most important kind of holiday in China, and spent almost 3 months in different quarantine facilities because although he tested negative when he boarded the plane, he tested positive when he arrived, and then once he was cured, he was a close contact of someone else who tested positive, and one of the, so it's a very, it's literally, I think, a country that is effectively closed to the outside world physically, unless one is willing to endure these very kind of long periods of transition, which means there's much less interaction between China, on an individual personal level, China and the outside world, including scholarly interactions, diplomatic interactions, economic interactions. And so I don't know what the long-term impact will be, but certainly I think it is a sign, although it may have started out as a sign of confidence that China could sort of squash COVID, it now looks like it may more be a sign of insecurity, right? That it cannot ever let COVID spread in the country. And I think the nature of this pandemic, and of course, I'm not a scientist or an epidemiologist, but it looks as if most countries will be moving to a situation where they will learn to manage COVID, which means they will have spread and outbreaks within their individual borders. This certainly is the default approach in the United States now. And in Europe, it looks like, you can tell me if it's the Indian approach. It appears from my vantage point to be roughly the Indian approach. Try to vaccinate your populations, reduce the severity of severe illness, but not really close your borders or cut off interactions with the rest of the world. And so if this were any country other than China, it might even be more consequential. But because China is such a manufacturing powerhouse and critical economy in the global economy, I'm not sure what the long run impact will be on sort of perceptions of China's economic performance. And the real question is whether or not this dynamic zero COVID policy does impact the economy in a much more meaningful and substantial way. It certainly seems to be creating short-term logistical bottlenecks, in part because provinces in China can block vehicles coming from other provinces, so they can kind of implement their own kind of COVID quarantine facility borders, et cetera. And that, of course, will have ripple effects on the global economy to the degree that there's more disruptions in the supply chains, which could lead the countries to further focus on kind of supply chain diversity, which might not necessarily be in China's best interest going forward. But I think it's hard to say what the actual kind of economic impact will be. But I do think there's sort of maybe a perception forming, right, that zero COVID is no longer as enviable as it may have been before, because when you do have outbreaks, which are much more contagious version of the virus, such as Omicron and its variants, then it is perhaps probably uncontainable at the end of the day. I mean, maybe you can minimize it, but to me, it just having casually observed what has happened this winter with Omicron in other countries, right? It is basically seems like it's nearly impossible to fully contain in the way that China had been able to contain other variants. And if subsequent variants are even more contagious, right, then the problem for China becomes even greater. And this, I think, is a really important issue to watch in the run up to the Party Congress, because what if there's an even more significant outbreak in September or October, right? It would be a very significant event in China.
Mm-hmm. Well, my last question to you, Professor Fravel, will be on how China is dealing with some of the countries. Earlier it seemed impossible. For example, with Indonesia, we are seeing how quietly China is warming up to them. Indonesia, in fact, was invited for the meeting on Afghanistan, and India was not, although that meeting was on Afghanistan's neighbors and also on the Solomon Islands, right? That is something the US has suddenly, they've woken up to the fact that, if they do a deal with Solomon Islands, they will have a proper sort of positioning themselves at the South Pacific. So how do you see those dynamics working out?
Well, I think that's an important sign, right, that whatever we just talked about in terms of the domestic situation in China, right, its diplomacy remains as active as ever, right, and continuing to sort of advance its sort of interest and goals. I think China has long realized that it needs to strengthen its position within Asia diplomatically, because there are lots of sources of tension. All the various territorial disputes with Japan in South China Sea. This became a real issue with Indonesia in particular because of Chinese fishing vessels that would enter the EEZ around Natuna Island, and Indonesia has a particularly harsh approach to illegal fishing, which is right to capture the vessels and then blow them up without their crew or cargo on board, but nevertheless, right, to actually physically destroy the fishing vessels. And I think China, for a decade or more, has very quietly but steadily engaged various islands in the South Pacific and Oceania, partly driven by a Taiwan logic, partly perhaps driven by a much longer strategic logic. If China would be able to gain sort of permanent military access there. I don't think the current agreement with the Solomon Islands creates that kind of access. It appears mostly to be an internal security agreement, one in which Chinese forces could be invited into the country to deal with domestic problems that could create a pretext for a permanent facility, but I don't think we're there yet. And you see, obviously, a very rapid reaction by not just the United States, which is sending a pretty significant delegation this week or next week, but also Australia and other countries. But nevertheless, it's a sign that China's diplomacy remains kind of, as we would say, using an American basketball sort of analogy, like a full court press, right? China is kind of pressing in all directions at all the time, which is what it has sort of done for a long time, seeing where there's opportunity to advance Chinese interests and objectives. And the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, of course, very important in that regard, but you see China being very active in Latin America and parts of Africa. China now has more diplomatic missions overseas than any other country, including the United States, and that number may even continue to grow in the future. And so this is a key element of China's vision of securing itself in the world. Because remember, China doesn't have any allies. North Korea is a treaty ally on paper, but it's not like a strategic asset for China. It's much more of a liability. It's not part of a grouping like NATO. It doesn't have close ties with groupings like the EU, and so it really has to kind of fend for itself economically and diplomatically. Now you have seen China take steps over the years to sort of supercharge its diplomacy. I think the BRICS is sort of one example of this. Finding countries that have sort of similar interests in certain areas and developing a diplomatic framework around them. You see this in China's sort of regional diplomacy, where it has the China-Africa Forum and different forums to engage Latin America, the Gulf states, and so forth. And so I think that they're just useful reminders, the two examples that right, that Chinese diplomacy remains very active and critical to advancing its objectives, in part because of its status as a country without kind of natural allies, much less formal treaty allies. And so it has to kind of seek relationships wherever it can find them, and seek advantage wherever it can find them. And diplomacy is often, the best tool for China to use because it has the least friction, and in some ways more potential upside.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Professor Fravel, thank you so much for talking to ThePrint. It's always a delight to discuss issues with you. You please take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be with you again.
Thank you.